this is the wonderful news. We have this, major contract with a, one of the largest consumer electronics companies in the world. The problem was, I didn't know, neither me nor the team that I was assembling, which was largely the team I had, at Compaq, knew a thing about consumer electronics. And if you look at what we were being asked to deliver, one, a strategic plan unifying all these disparate units. These companies were really being run as a portfolio of companies, independent companies, rather than an integrated whole. Two, they wanted some really deep, strategic investments. And these have to be not only financially interesting, but strategically interesting to the company. The company had not done any venture capital investments in the Valley. They were really isolated, from all the major players, Sun, Cisco, Microsoft, etc. And in some ways even isolated from competitors like Sony, etc. So the idea was, hey, we need to really forge these things. The other thing was it was really seen, and frankly to some degree it's still seen, as sort of not a visionary company, but just sort of like boom boxes, or I don't know, the brand didn't really have that robust feeling. And it was, the thought was, hey, with the right vision, the right moves, that we can really transform that. And finally, in support of that, too, we always did these projects on the edge. I did them at UB, we did them at Tandem, we did them at Compaq, which was taking ideas that are likely to come to market in the next 10 years or so. And if you're willing to take a posture of cost is no object to do it, a lot of times you can really bring them forward in a super expensive way. But from a perception perspective, you really look like, oh my God, these guys are way out in the future. So that was a play we did for our turnarounds, and we were doing it. And remember, I'm doing this with Roel Pieper, who, we've been through many different, we've been through 3 companies together. This is this was the agenda we did in each case. So then the question becomes, how do you do all this if you don't know the space? I mean, this is really, this is very sophisticated stuff. Not only we didn't know the space, we didn't know people in the space. So that, in my normal things, it's like I know 1,000 people to call, like this professor, hey, could you check this out for me? Does this do? This executive at this other situation, hey, I'm thinking about that. Does it fly? Resources, consulting, advisors, etc. We didn't have that. So at that point, I thought, what we really need to do, given these circumstances, I had done scenarios. It was like, okay, let's do scenarios again. But this time, it's really critical, because not only is it a tool for understanding, views of what various futures can be, but it's really critical to just learn the industry. And so it would serve, with scenarios, you end up going out there initially and talking to a lot of people, 50 people, 100 people, outliers, people at the center, people inside your company, at your competitors, outside. This seemed like a really nice, safe way to, go and explore, learn what this world was about, and frankly build a bit of a network that you could then call on for advice, for leads, for various things. The other thing was, in a large corporate setting like that, where a new executive comes in, and we were his agents in effect, he was sponsoring us. There's other power centers in the company which are, viciously opposed to you, and their goal is to, destroy your agenda, because if you're successful, they're seeing it as a risk to their future. And frankly, I needed a method for myself and my team to be able to just engage with these people on safe territory. It's one thing if you're going to someone and say, I want to look at your business plan. He's in defensive mode. He's, hey, is this guy going to hurt me? Versus going to him and say, how do you see the future of consumer electronics? What do you see as the future of television? What are the factors you think are going to be driving you? What events are scaring you the most at night? Sort of a really nice exploratory conversation. I don't know, it was just it seemed like a really, really powerful tool for building relationships, building understanding, and then being able to later on leverage some of this. So let's talk a little bit about scenario planning. You know, basically this is forecasting, and what Phillips did at the time was they did some very, very sophisticated, highly developed forecasts of the future, of the future, and for their plans. And typically this was based on what? On a lot of fairly known things, like, the curve on semiconductors, the curve on displays, the curve on various, analog technologies. And, then consider some of the competitive factors. And this is how they were typically doing their planning, based on knowns and trends. And frankly, looking at the future of consumer electronics 5 to 7 years, this seemed like, frankly, ludicrous to think that you could capture the variables, at the time just Microsoft was surging with power. The future was so dependent on how Microsoft would play out. The future was so, at the time no one was thinking of Apple, maybe Apple's injection of itself into the industry. I don't know, there was just, the regulatory environment, what are the implications of that? The whole globalization, what are the implications of it? And, in terms of scenario-based planning, you really, whereas here forecasts, you're primarily focusing on knowns and, established trends. In scenario planning, the whole focus is what do I not know? What are the uncertainties? Not only the unknowns, but unknowables today. And clearly, we're not talking about this kind of small, limited differences. We're talking about entirely different worlds. And so much of the process here is, the process here would be, we'd go out and we'd speak to like a broad cross-section of people, asking what are the factors, what are the events, what are the uncertainties you really focused on, and you might have like 100 of these. You can have more, and now you have like this huge, frankly, this huge mess of stuff. But after you've talked to 20, 30, 50 people, you really start having, I think, some sense for, how some of these variables are going to play together. To do like a scenario here, which is internally consistent, you're not going to be looking at, it is internally consistent. And these lines you're seeing here, once you've established these generic, broad-based like differences in scenarios, and we're going to go in and we're going to show you actual scenarios we developed with, the actual variables. To make it real, we have to go back and say, okay, this is where the outcome is. Now let's do the actual events, the actual newspaper headlines that you would see that would get you to this reality, to this world. These are unknowns. And then in this, which is also internally consistent, what are the variables and how can you, what set of headlines get there? So that, so that you get, I guess, more comfortable with these things. So basically, the alternate vision of the future. The focus again is what you don't know, not just what you do know, not just what you can measure. But the things you can measure oftentimes are the least relevant, the least powerful. And I think they can have this really powerful force because once you do them, you have a story. And as humans, we can really relate to stories. And then what we would do is we would put the executives, ask them to imagine themselves in that world, in that future, 5 years, 7 years out, and then to start thinking, okay, if this is the world, what are the kinds of alliances I need? What are the kinds of skill sets I need? And it's a radically different kind of thinking process than the forecast one where it's not stated, but the presumption is it's today's world you're staying with. And so this last point is, they're used to work backwards in time to today. I think this is another thought which is really important to say. When you look at industry evolution, typically it goes through really embryonic, where it's really the very early adopters doing things, and then through a growth phase, maturity, and aging. Well, Philips as a company, being the light bulbs, displays, etc., really the way they were thinking about the world was in the mature and aging kind of thinking. And frankly, for that purpose, forecasting isn't that bad, because it's, there isn't huge change in a maturing or aging environment. The trouble was, though, and we could really sense it, around this time, there was this heavy move from analog to digital, which has completely transforms the whole game from, every which way you can think about it. And, so it was our guess that, scenarios could be the, sort of the flashlight that really points out this fundamental transformation in the industry, where forecasting is really a joke in that sort of a dynamic. So just a couple other thoughts about scenarios before moving it in, and then I'm going to hand it to Simon, who'll go through the details of exactly how did we do it and what scenarios did we develop. It's good, it helps you break out of your preconceived notions of present and the future. They're stories that help us suspend this belief in possible futures. They make sense. And as you know, mostly it's really hard for us to think about more than one future. And frankly, in a situation where you get like 80 variables, it's impossible to capture that rich sense of, possibility and probabilities in any one picture. What this does is it really helps you establish 3, 4, 5, whatever number you choose to do, of these worlds. And if you then try out each of these worlds for a while, then you feel them, you know them, you get a sense of them, and you see them as, hey, this is a realistic possibility that I might have to live in. I think this point here, it lets you really start getting creative, maybe even revolutionary at times. And this last point is really critical to understand. When we first started talking about scenarios, everyone at Philips was like, oh, scenarios for the future of Philips, and we really made a big deal of it. No, Philips isn't even, we don't want to even look at Philips. First, we're going to establish the world that Philips will find itself in. Only then will we start thinking about Philips strategies, but then we will think about Philips strategies, because if Philips finds itself in that world, how's it going to deal with it? So, here this sort of tells you, it lets you do this practice in these future worlds. And frankly, I think it's important, the people who gain the most from scenarios are the people who actually develop them, which is an odd thing, because sometimes the people developing the scenarios aren't really the most senior decision makers, but they're the ones that end up getting the deepest understanding of it. And it's important to try to transfer as much of that as possible to senior management. So you really can see it as a tool for embracing the uncertainty that really does exist. And it's a tool that really lets you be much more playful, provocative, etc., than, frankly, in my opinion, many of the more quantitative-oriented approaches. And it really helps you envision the future and envision the possibilities and paths to migrating to that future. It can be a tool for transforming companies and maybe even the world. This is a cool quote I like. Edward de Bono is a guy, thinker on thinking. One of my favorites. I like this quote. There's this totally absurd notion that knowledge only proceeds by neat steps from knowing known facts through logical deduction. And this was a survey of Nobel laureates. And they were asked, what was the breakthrough driver for you? And it's like something like 90% of it. It's play, speculation, anomaly, imagination. And only, I don't know, 10% we're saying is like through systematic analysis. So, I don't know, I see that as, supportive of that note.